Welcome back. So now practically in the same breath in which we just introduced you to Menander and Middle Comedy and New Comedy, now we're going to race on ahead, having covered the end of the history for Greece into Roman literature and Roman history. And now we're going to talk about the first of our two Roman playwrights named Terence. So please now at this point pause the video and go to Sakai under Resources and locate handout number 3. This is the third of 4 handouts, and this is the one pertaining to Terence. So please pause your video and open the handout number 3 on Terence. Okay, are you all set? Awesome. So now that we are proceeding, having very quickly covered Greek comedy into the period of Roman comedy, we're going to see a fair number of similarities to Greek New Comedy, because that was the one on which Roman comedy was based. But there will also be some differences as well. Again, we're going to cover those differences in a later video on Roman comedy, so I will only mention them here as pertinent to Terence. But you should realize that the Roman comedy is similar in many ways with Greek Middle Comedy and New Comedy. It does overlap with it, but it is not precisely the same. The Romans do have different staging requirements for the way that they put up the stage and the performance, and that's actually going to be discussed here, and also have a different sensibility about the way some of the characters interact with each other, the way that they view the Greeks and such, the way that slaves especially behave, and so that's also going to affect somewhat the way that plots and the development of various climaxes and denouement are going to occur in a Roman comedy versus the way that it might occur in the equivalent Greek comedy. Okay, so let's go to your handout number 3 and talk about our fellow Terence, the first of our 2 Roman playwrights. So you notice that we now have come yet again another century or so later, sort of like, we'll say almost like a generation or so from Menander. So Terence was born, we have actually 2 dates of his birth, so I just used the earlier one as probably more likely, I think. Born in 195 BC approximately. It might have actually been as late as 185 BC, but we'll take it as 195 BC for this purpose. And he died, unfortunately, quite young at about 159 BC on a visit to Greece. It's really a shame that he did die so young, because we have only 6 plays of his surviving, which are all real masterpieces, and it's quite unfortunate that he did not live longer to be able to see his career really flourish. But in any event, we are blessed to have the 6 plays of Terence that we do in fact have. And I should mention that although there is some question in the case of the other playwright Plautus about which plays are genuinely his, in the case of Terence there is no question. There are only 6 of his that are attributed to him, and it's quite secure that those 6 plays are definitely the ones and the only ones that were authored by him. Now, I need to mention something about his name and his social position in Rome. This will come out somewhat more clearly in later videos as well, but I'll introduce it here. So you notice that although he's given the name Terence by us by convention, but you'll notice that he was born in Carthage, that is North Africa, and he came to Rome in the household of this senator Terentius Lucanus as a slave. So he was in fact initially a slave. Then later he was manumitted, that is, he was set free and became what is known in Rome as a libertus, or a freedman, which meant that now he was no longer obliged to serve anyone as a slave. However, a freedman was not really a completely free man, even though he was no longer a slave, because although he had most of the rights and privileges afforded to free-born men, he still had certain social obligations to his former master, who effectively became basically his patron, to whom he was also a client. So although he wouldn't have to serve his master directly the way that a slave would, if the master needed something from him, he would still be relatively obliged to go and assist him with whatever was needed. So he still had that tie. Also, freedmen typically could not enter public office, and were also restricted as to marriage, as to which families that they could run into. So they did have some places where they still could not penetrate, even though they were freedmen as opposed to slaves. One area, though, where freedmen often could excel quite a bit was in business, especially if their prior masters gave them quite a bit of money to help them invest in some new business. So freedmen were often outstanding entrepreneurs. Now, if you ever take my shameless plug 396 course, you'll get to read the Roman work by Petronius, the Satyricon, which we're actually going to discuss also in a later video in the same session in the satire and novel video. But Petronius' Satyricon shows the extent to which entrepreneurship for freedmen can actually get out of control, where you end up with certain entrepreneurs who become really, really wealthy, like filthy rich, because of their success in business and finance. So Petronius' satirical figure there is named Trimalchio. He puts on this extremely awful dinner party that a lot of people are obliged to go to because of their own freedman statuses and their own social client patron obligations. And so if you get to read that, you see how that works in a very negative way. So that's the kind of thing that Terence might have been experiencing as a freedman. So he was very lucky as a freedman, though, because he was very well connected with a lot of the major families, especially the Scipio family. And it was through that he was able to get enough patronage to be able to eventually start writing plays and putting them on and getting the great success with them. Now, when he was freed, you'll see in the handout, still Roman numeral 1, that he took on a new name, which was Publius Terentius Afer. Those are the three names that are typical of a Roman citizen's name. So Terentius is taken from the name of the family to whom he had been a slave, and Afer is an additional cognomen, so-called in Latin, which basically means an additional name that helps distinguish different members of a gens, that is the clan, by family. And Afer also means African, and so therefore it's a tie-in with Terence's original birth in Africa. So aside from all that information I can provide about the freedman position, there isn't actually much else about Terence himself that we do know. So we just simply have to be aware that he was in fact originally Carthaginian and had been a slave, then became free, and then he was writing as a playwright. Okay, so if we go down to Roman numeral 2, you can see his theatrical career. The 6 plays are listed there. And as I say, it was his prominent status with important, wealthy Roman families that got him the recognition that he needed. So the 6 plays are given to you there. The one that we're reading in this class is that last one, Adelphoi, the Brothers. You can see that one was put in 160 BC for funeral games. And all of these plays were successful, with the initial exception that I have to talk about here of the Hekyra, the mother-in-law. That one had a bit of a problem. We'll come to that in a little bit. But in general, the plays turned out to be very successful, and that's why, again, it's unfortunate that Terence didn't have an opportunity to live longer and be able to put on more of the plays. As you'll also notice, these plays were all based on Greek models. The Roman term for a play is fabula, and there's a particular subcategory of fabula palliata, which means, basically as a metaphor, a play that is dressed up in Greek garb and therefore is a model, is based on a model from a Greek play by a Greek playwright. So all of Terence's plays are in that category, and that's why you can see in the handout the listing of references to the Greek plays, including Menander, as the models for what he wrote. Now, one thing at the bottom of the first page of the handout, E, one concept of Terence that was a little bit of a problematic aspect, apparently in Roman literary criticism, was this thing called contaminatio. Now, it looks like the word contamination in English. What it actually refers to in a literary sense is the blending of multiple scenes from different plays into a single play. Now, Plautus also did this, and so it's unlikely that Terence was a unique violator of this rule, or even the most egregious violator of this rule. But apparently he got some kickback from some of his plays, some pushback that in fact he maybe shouldn't have been mixing up the plots of plays quite the way he did. So in fact, he carries out this practice. And one thing that changes with Terence from Greek comedy, and to some extent even from Plautus, is that Terence will use the prologue of the play no longer to talk about the plot, the way, for instance, back in Clouds, Stripsiades talked about his debt, or Pan in the beginning of Discalus talks about how he's going to punish this grouchy old slave. None of this comes up here with Terence. Instead, what he gets at is in the face of his literary critics saying, well, sure, I know that I committed contaminatio, but I don't care. And so did other playwrights, including Plautus. And so I'm just doing the same thing that everybody else is doing, and it's a better play forward. So do me something. So Terence, in fact, gives justification for why his play should win its competition, instead of bothering to describe the plot, which of course will unfold gradually in the course of the play itself. You'll actually see, well, later on when you read Plautus's Braggart Soldier, that the clever slave actually does go through a very long prologue of describing the plot of the play. So for Terence not to do so here and to let the play speak for itself is in fact rather unusual and innovative. Okay, so but contaminatio, in fact, this process of mixing plays together was something that apparently Roman critics did not like, but Terence was quite willing to be innovative and do it anyway. So Terence is very careful, unlike his colleague Plautus, in trying to follow the Greek plays as closely as possible. And although he's innovative in terms of plot, he tends not to put a lot of bells and whistles, like a lot of shtick, a lot of asides, what are called cantica, which are the sung aria pieces that appear quite a lot in Plautus's plays. Terence instead sticks with mainstream dialogue much more, and tries to make the plot much more consistent and interrupted a lot less frequently, punctuated a lot less often by outside elements that may tend to interrupt the progress of the plot. So therefore, Terence is much more concerned with exploring the psychological makeup of his characters, what's often referred to as humanitas in Latin. In other words, trying to be sympathetic with the reasons why the characters are behaving the way they are, so that although they may be comic and in some cases ridiculous or even silly, we can see what's going on and we can understand what's motivating them to behave the way they can, so we can learn from them. A little bit like the way that the tragedy might work, but also with a little bit of a message for the audience of Romans and other nationalities too, to say this is a common feature of human nature. You might as well see how it works, and maybe you'll end up in your own life being able to be a little bit less inclined to this kind of behavior yourself. So so Terence's sympathy toward humankind is what distinguishes his plays especially, and what gave him a very strong reputation in later times. So okay, so Roman comedy, as we mentioned, is fairly similar to Greek comedy, and you've already seen the new comedy video, and you will very soon be seeing the Roman comedy video. But there are some important differences. One is that, unlike Greek comedy, there is no chorus in a Roman comedy, and there are no interruptions by any kind of outside element like a chorus. So although you'll see in your yellow and purple textbook so-called acts, actually there would have been no interruption of the plot in the Roman play. It would have just kept it right on going. The use of specific sung parts, almost like a Broadway musical, the so-called cantica, show up in Plautus quite a bit, but less often in Terence. But that's a feature that, although you can see it in spots in the ancient Greek plays, seems to be a much more developed phenomenon in the Roman plays. And wherever you see italicized writing, especially in your edited text, that's where the cantica is happening, where you have a sung piece by a specific actor. Probably one of the most important differences between a Roman play and a Greek play that comes up with your discussion questions is that slaves are treated quite differently in the Roman world, and that's because of this matter of manumission. And Terence himself might have been sensitive to that since he himself was a manumitted ex-slave. So Roman slaves are pushing very hard to become free. The equivalent slaves, you may remember in Discalus by Menander, never really seemed to be looking toward any opportunity to become free. They stay slaves, and they seem to be content to remain slaves. There never seems to be any sense that they might eventually become free. And in fact, in all the plays that we've read, really the only slave who's rather restive about his slave status is Xanthias in Frogs, but that's because of a special reason. Remember that Xanthias wasn't able to become a free man as he might have been because he failed to participate in the Battle of Arginusae. So that's unusual. But in general, Greek slaves don't usually have much opportunity for manumission, but in Roman society, manumission is a big thing that slaves might be able to accomplish. So manumission works its way into the plots even when it might not necessarily have happened as much in the original Greek plot. So those are some basic differences, and we'll talk more about it in the Roman comedy video. The last thing I want to mention, though, a very humorous aspect about Terence's play, the Hekyra, the mother-in-law, has to do with this matter of the stage. The Romans never had a permanent stage for any kind of theatrics until 55 BC, which as you see is over 100 years after Terence's life, and it's even longer after Plautus's life. There were no permanent stages until 55 BC when Pompey the Great built the first one in Rome. Prior to that, staging was done on temporary wooden sets in a carnival with lots of noise, acrobats, and tightrope walkers, and probably people drinking. So this was quite difficult for the playwright to be able to perform a play, because trying to get his audience to pay attention to it and not get distracted by other things going on like somebody on a tightrope was really, really challenging. What happens in Hekyra is, and we learn this from the prologue of the play, is that Terence put on the mother-in-law one time, and in the middle of the play, somebody yelled out, "Look, tightrope walkers!" And everybody just got up and left the play behind. The second time he came back out again and put on the play, and somebody yelled out, "Look, acrobats!" And the same thing happened. Everybody jumped up and ran off, and again Terence's play got abandoned. And so finally the third time, Terence puts in his prologue, "Okay, everybody, this time you're going to stay in your chairs and watch this play. This is a really good play. Don't you dare abandon it this time, or I'll be so angry." And turns out that this time the audience was able to watch without distraction, and they got to see the mother-in-law, which is in fact quite an innovative play in its own right, and you actually should read it separately. It has a very interesting surprise twist at the end of it regarding the character of the mother-in-law. I will leave that for you to read on your own if you choose. But Terence really had his troubles with that particular play, and that must have been very gratifying for him to finally win on the third try with the mother-in-law, and therefore make it a perfect 6 for 6. Okay, so that is Terence, our third playwright. So read over his play carefully, especially observe where you see similarities and differences with Menander, and of course start getting ready with your videos for your video day assignment, because now you're going to be looking at a broader range of different kinds of comedy to compare with now 3 different styles of plays. So look that all up, and you'll be getting ready soon to complete your 4th and final video day assignment. Okay, we will see you next video.